The sky was painted in shades of crimson and gold that evening when the twins stood beside their mother's grave. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of dry earth and sorrow. The small town of Dry Creek had gathered earlier that morning to say their final goodbye to the woman who had once been their midwife, their healer, and to some, their only friend. But when the sun began to dip behind the distant ridges, the townsfolk drifted away one by one, leaving only 2 children behind, their hands clutched together, their faces streaked with tears and dust. They were no older than 9, mirror images of each other with their mother's soft brown eyes and pale sunburned skin. The townspeople called them the twins, never by name, as if their identities didn't matter after their mother passed. In life, their mother had been respected, though never fully accepted. She had been a white woman who had once lived among the Apache, and though no one spoke it aloud, everyone knew the children's father was not a white man. That truth hung in the air like the smell of smoke after a prairie fire, lingering, uncomfortable and impossible to forget. The preacher had said a few kind words over the grave, but his eyes had avoided the twins. The storekeeper's wife had given them bread, though she wrapped it in an old rag and handed it over as if she feared touching their hands. When the last wagon left and the dust settled, the twins were alone. They didn't speak. They just stood there, their small fingers entwined, watching the light fade. By nightfall, the coyotes began to howl across the plains. Their sharp cries cut through the silence and sent a shiver down the children's spines. The boy pulled his sister close, whispering that they should find shelter before dark swallowed them whole. They walked down the hill toward the cabin that had once been home, the one their mother built with her own hands when she came to Dry Creek years ago. Its roof sagged now and the front steps creaked like tired bones. Inside, everything smelled of dust and emptiness. The girl found her mother's shawl draped over the chair and held it to her face. It still carried her scent, wild sage and wood smoke. She didn't cry. Her eyes were too dry for tears. She had cried all she could. Her brother tried to light the lantern, but there was no oil left. They sat together in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Morning came cold and colorless. When the twins stepped outside, they saw the town sheriff waiting by the gate, his hat pulled low and his jaw tight. Behind him stood 2 townsmen with grim faces and a wagon ready. He didn't waste words. He told them the cabin didn't belong to them anymore. Their mother owed debts she never paid, and without her the land would be sold. The girl begged him to let them stay just until winter passed, but he looked away. "It's not my decision," he said flatly, though everyone knew it was. The boy's hands curled into fists, but he said nothing. They were told to gather their things, though there wasn't much to take: an old blanket, a few clothes, and a wooden box with their mother's keepsakes. When the sheriff drove away, leaving them standing in the road with the dust swirling around their feet, it was clear no one in Dry Creek intended to take them in. The children walked for miles that day, unsure of where to go. The townsfolk had turned their backs, and the only other direction was the open wilderness, the endless desert that stretched toward the far mountains, where the sun burned like fire and the wind carried whispers of a different world. Their mother had often told them stories of the Apache who lived beyond those ridges, stories of bravery, loyalty, and spirits that guarded the land. She had said their father was among them once, though she never spoke his name. As dusk settled again, they found themselves near the edge of the canyon, exhausted and hungry. The boy gathered dry grass and tried to start a fire with flint, but his hands trembled. The girl huddled close, clutching their mother's shawl. Every sound in the darkness made her flinch. The rustle of a lizard, the cry of a hawk overhead. Then came a deeper sound, low and steady, like hooves against the earth. They froze. From behind the rocks, a figure emerged, tall, wrapped in deerskin, with hair as black as night and eyes that caught the last of the firelight. He carried a bow slung across his shoulder and a knife at his belt. His face was unreadable, but his stance was calm, not threatening. The twins backed away, unsure if they should run or speak. The warrior looked at them silently for a long moment before lowering his bow. He spoke in a deep, even voice, his words slow and careful. "You should not be here. The night belongs to spirits." The boy tried to speak but only managed to whisper, "We have nowhere else to go." The man studied them, his gaze moving from their faces to the worn shawl the girl held. His expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. He stepped closer, kneeling so his face was level with theirs. "Your mother," he said quietly. "She was the woman who lived by the river once. I remember her, the girl nodded. She's gone now. For a long while he said nothing. The only sound was the wind moving through the canyon grass. Then he stood and gestured toward the east. There is a camp not far from here. You can come for the night. The coyotes will not bother you there. The twins hesitated. They had been warned by townspeople never to trust Apache. But something in his voice, steady and gentle, broke through their fear. They followed him through the shadows, their small steps quick behind his long strides. When they reached the camp, a small fire burned in a circle of stones. 2 horses were tied nearby and a blanket of stars stretched above them. The warrior handed them water and a piece of dried meat. The girl whispered her thanks, her voice trembling. The boy, still wary, ate in silence. After a while, the man spoke again. Your mother was brave. She saved lives in the valley when fever came. My people remember her. His eyes softened, though his face stayed solemn. She once asked me to watch over her children if she did not return from the town. The girl's eyes widened.
She told you about us?
He nodded. Long ago. She said your hearts would be strong, but the world might be cruel. The firelight flickered across their faces. The twins sat quietly, unsure what to feel, fear, hope, or both. The boy asked, what will happen to us now? The man looked toward the dark hills as if searching for an answer in the distance. The world beyond this place is harsh, he said softly. But I gave her my word. I will not let harm come to you. They didn't know what that promise meant or where it would lead. The flames crackled between them, and for the first time in days, warmth touched their skin. But beyond the fire's glow, the land stretched wild and uncertain. Somewhere out there, danger waited, men who believed the twins had no right to live, and spirits that tested every soul who dared to cross the desert. As the night deepened, the warrior rose, scanning the horizon. His posture grew tense. He could feel it, the stillness that came before trouble. He told the twins to stay by the fire, his voice low but firm. The boy wanted to ask what he saw, but before he could, the warrior lifted his hand, signaling silence. From far off came the faint echo of hooves and the glint of metal catching moonlight. The girl gripped her brother's hand. The warrior's face hardened. They are coming, he said quietly. The twins turned toward the dark horizon, hearts pounding. They didn't know who was coming or why. All they knew was that the man who promised to protect them had suddenly become their only shield against a world that had already turned its back on them. The fire crackled louder, the night wind rising. The twins could see the first shadows moving through the canyon, and the warrior reached for his bow. The desert held its breath, and for a moment the world stood still. The storm was coming, and this was only the beginning. The night air was sharp and dry as the sound of hooves drew closer. The Apache warrior's hand moved with calm precision as he strung his bow, his eyes locked on the canyon's mouth. The twins sat frozen by the fire, their small bodies trembling. The boy wanted to be brave, to stand like the man who had promised to protect them. But fear wrapped around his chest and made it hard to breathe. The girl clung to the shawl, the same one their mother had always worn, pressing it against her face as though it could hide her from the danger creeping near. The warrior stepped forward, his figure lit by the fire's orange glow. His voice was low but firm when he spoke. Stay quiet. Do not move until I tell you. The boy nodded, swallowing hard. The sound of the riders was louder now. Whoever they were, they rode fast and without care for the rocks or dust. That meant they were either desperate or sure of their strength. In a few moments, the flicker of torchlight appeared in the darkness. The boy could see the shape of men on horseback, maybe 4 or 5. Their faces were hidden by the shadows, but their voices carried through the canyon. He caught pieces of their words, twins, half-bloods, and reward. The boy didn't fully understand what those words meant, but the way the men said them made his stomach twist. The warrior crouched beside the fire, grabbing a handful of dirt to smother the flames. The light faded, leaving only moonlight spilling across the stones. He whispered in Apache, words the twins couldn't understand, then motioned for them to follow. They crept toward a cluster of boulders where the earth dropped into a narrow path leading down to the dry riverbed. The warrior led the way, moving as silent as shadow. The girl stumbled once, her foot catching on a root, and the small sound made one of the riders stop. The man's voice echoed through the canyon. I heard something. Over there. He spurred his horse forward, and the others followed, their boots striking the ground in heavy rhythm. The warrior turned sharply, his face hard as stone, and pulled the twins behind a rock. He waited until the horses were nearly upon them, then drew his bow. The arrow flew through the air with a soft hiss, striking one of the men's torches. The flame burst and fell, scattering sparks. The riders shouted, startled. In the confusion, the warrior grabbed the twins and rushed them down the slope. The boy's heart pounded as they ran, stumbling through brush and loose soil. The shouts behind them grew fainter, but not enough to bring comfort. They didn't stop until the canyon opened into the wide desert plain. The moon hung high, washing the land in pale silver light. The warrior finally slowed, his breath even despite the long run. The twins collapsed to the ground, exhausted. The girl looked back, her eyes wide. "Who were they?" she whispered. "Men who hunt what they do not understand," he said simply. His voice carried no anger, only weariness. "Your mother feared this might happen. There are those in the town who think your blood makes you less. To them you are something to cast away, or worse." The boy frowned. "Why?" "We never hurt anyone." The warrior looked at him for a long time before answering. "People fear what is different. Your mother knew both worlds, white and Apache. Some hated her for that, and now they hate what she left behind." The words cut deep, though the twins were too young to grasp their full meaning. All they knew was that the place they called home no longer wanted them. The girl leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, whispering, "Mama said the world is cruel only until it learns your heart." The warrior's eyes softened when he heard her. "She spoke truth," he said quietly. By dawn, they reached a cluster of trees near a stream hidden from the open plain. The warrior started a small fire and handed the children pieces of dried corn and venison from his pouch. The food was tough, but it filled their stomachs. For the first time since their mother's death, the twins felt a small spark of safety. The warrior told them his name was Lone Hawk, a name given by his people for the way he traveled the plains alone. He said he once had a family, but war and time had taken them. When their mother crossed his path years ago, she had been kind to him when few others were. He never forgot that. "She was brave," he said, his voice low. "She came to our camp with sickness spreading through her town. She asked for herbs and medicine for the children there. She cared for others even when they turned away from her." He looked toward the horizon, his face shadowed with memory. When she left, she said if the day came that her children needed help, I would know them by her eyes. Now I see those same eyes. The twins listened, feeling both proud and sad. Their mother's spirit seemed to live in every word he spoke. The boy asked softly, "Did you know our father?" Lone Hawk hesitated. His hand paused over the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. "I knew him," he said finally. "He was one of my people, a good man who walked between two worlds, same as your mother. But his path was dangerous. There were those who wanted to end the peace he tried to build. Where is he now?" the girl asked. Lone Hawk shook his head. "No one has seen him for many seasons. Some say he fell in battle. Others believe he still walks among the mountains, guarding those he loved." His voice grew quiet. "Your mother never stopped hoping he would return." The morning light shimmered across the desert and the warmth began to creep into the air. Lone Hawk rose and tightened the straps on his horse. "We cannot stay here," he said. "The men who followed us last night will not stop. There is a place deep in the canyons where my people sometimes take refuge. You will be safe there for a while." The twins followed as he led the way across the plains. The land stretched endless, dotted with dry brush and stones that shimmered in the heat. The boy's legs ached, but he didn't complain. The girl stayed close behind, her hand still clutching their mother's shawl. The further they went, the quieter the world became, as if the desert itself was watching them. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of a hawk's cry echoed above them. Lone Hawk glanced up, his face unreadable. "The land speaks if you listen," he said. "Your mother once learned to hear it. You must learn too." The boy tilted his head, trying to catch what the man meant, but all he heard was the whisper of wind and the distant roll of thunder. Lone Hawk stopped suddenly, kneeling beside a patch of sand. He brushed his hand over it and frowned. There were fresh tracks, horses moving fast. He pressed his palm against the ground. "They are close." Fear returned to the twins' faces. The girl clutched her brother's arm. Lone Hawk looked toward the cliffs ahead. "We will take the canyon. If they follow, they will not find us easily." They quickened their pace, following a narrow trail that wound between red stone walls. The air grew cooler there and shadows danced across the rocks. Birds scattered as they passed, their wings flashing white in the dim light. The twins felt the ground tremble faintly underfoot. Distant hoofbeats again. Lone Hawk turned sharply, urging them to move faster. The path grew steeper, twisting through narrow openings until they reached a hidden plateau covered in tall grass and wild sage. A shallow cave lay beneath an overhang of stone. He motioned for the twins to enter.
Stay inside, he said.
No matter what you hear. The boy wanted to protest, but the look in Lone Hawk's eyes stopped him. The warrior moved back toward the trail, disappearing into the sunlight. The twins waited in the cave, their breath shallow. Every sound outside felt louder. The rustle of grass, the creak of saddle leather, the faint clink of metal. Then came voices again. Tracks end here, one man said. Spread out. He can't be far. The boy held his sister's hand tight. They could see shadows moving just beyond the mouth of the cave. One of the men dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. I told you he was hiding them, another voice growled. That Apache's been trouble since the day he showed up. There was silence, then the sound of a bowstring snapping through the air. A cry followed, sharp and sudden. The twins flinched. Then chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, hooves pounding. The girl buried her face in her brother's shoulder. When it finally went quiet, only the wind remained. The boy dared to look out, his heart thundering. The canyon floor was empty now, but smoke hung in the air. Lone Hawk was nowhere in sight. The girl whispered, "Is he gone?" But the boy didn't answer. He stared toward the open desert where dark figures moved faintly in the distance. The chase was not over. The twins didn't yet understand it, but the path they had stepped onto, the one their mother and father had walked before them, was far from safe. The world beyond that canyon held secrets, and every secret came with a cost. The sound of thunder rolled again across the horizon, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the earth itself was warning them that the worst was yet to come. The silence after the gunfire felt heavier than sound itself. The twins crouched inside the shallow cave, afraid to move. Dust drifted through the air, catching thin rays of sunlight that slipped through the rocks. The boy could hear his heartbeat in his ears, and the faint echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance. When he finally dared to crawl toward the edge of the cave, the desert stretched out before him, empty and endless. Lone Hawk was gone. The girl tugged on his sleeve. "Do you think he's hurt?" she whispered. The boy didn't answer. He wanted to believe the warrior had survived, that he was out there somewhere watching over them, but fear crept into his chest like a cold wind. He told her to stay inside while he looked. She didn't want to let go of his hand, but he promised he wouldn't go far. He stepped carefully out into the open, the sun burning bright against the red canyon walls. The ground bore signs of struggle, tracks, broken branches, a dropped arrow. Farther ahead, near a bend in the path, he found something that made his stomach tighten. It was Lone Hawk's bow, lying half buried in the dust. The string had snapped. He picked it up, brushing the dirt away, and felt a strange ache in his chest. Before he could turn back, he heard a faint sound, a low groan carried by the wind. He froze and listened again. It came from behind a cluster of rocks farther down the trail. The boy ran toward it and found Lone Hawk half-conscious, leaning against a boulder, his shoulder streaked with blood. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes opened when he heard footsteps. "You shouldn't have come out," the warrior said weakly. The boy knelt beside him, trying to steady his voice. "We thought you were gone." Lone Hawk shook his head. "Not yet." He pressed a hand over the wound, grimacing. "One of them found me, but they won't follow now. They've gone to bring more." The boy's heart sank. "They're coming back?" "Yes," Lone Hawk said. "And next time they won't just be looking for me." He looked toward the cave, his expression grave. "They'll want both of you." The boy helped him back to the cave, the girl rushing forward to help. She tore a strip from her mother's shawl and handed it to the warrior. He smiled faintly, recognizing the fabric, then used it to tie off his wound. Though he was hurt, his spirit still seemed unbroken. As night fell, he told them more about the men who hunted them. "They work for the rancher who owns most of Dry Creek," he said. "Your mother once refused to leave her land when he tried to buy it. She said the land was meant to belong to the living and the spirits, not men who count gold." His voice grew quiet. That angered him. When she passed, he saw a chance to take everything she left behind. But he fears the truth of your blood. He wants to erase it. The twins sat in silence, trying to understand. Their mother's kindness had made her loved by some, but hated by others. Now that hatred had turned toward them. The boy clenched his fists. "We can't hide forever," he said. Lone Hawk nodded. "No, But to stand, you must first survive. The next few days were harsh. Lone Hawk's wound slowed him down and food was scarce. They moved only at dawn and dusk, following dry creek beds and narrow trails hidden from the open plains. The twins learned quickly how to walk without leaving tracks, how to listen for danger, how to read the wind. The warrior taught them to see signs others would miss. A broken twig, a shifted stone, the call of a bird that shouldn't be there. At night, they would sit by a small fire, the flames barely bright enough to see by. Lone Hawk told them stories of his people, of the old ways, of the spirits that guarded the desert, of battles fought to protect what could not be replaced. The twins listened closely, their fear slowly giving way to understanding, but danger still followed them. One evening, as they crossed a narrow ravine, the girls stopped suddenly. Smoke curled up from the horizon. It wasn't the thin line of a campfire. It was thick, rising fast. Lone Hawk's face darkened. "They're burning the land," he said. "They want to flush us out." They turned back into the canyons, but the fire spread quickly. The air filled with heat and ash. The twins coughed, their eyes stinging. The warrior led them to a shallow stream where they could wade through water to hide their scent. The girl stumbled, her foot sinking into the mud, and the boy pulled her free. The ground trembled with distant thunder, though no storm clouds hung above. When they finally stopped, they were deep inside a narrow gorge. The air was cooler there, and the sound of fire was far behind them. Lone Hawk leaned heavily against the rocks, breathing hard. The boy saw how pale he looked. "You need to rest," he said. The warrior shook his head. "Rest comes when the hunt ends." They made a small camp in the shadow of the cliffs. The twins gathered branches and helped clean his wound again. As the fire crackled softly, Lone Hawk spoke of the man behind it all, the rancher known as Brig. He had once been a soldier before taking land that didn't belong to him. "He believes strength is ownership," Lone Hawk said. "Your mother defied that belief. That is why he hunts you. You are proof that his power has limits." The boy stared into the fire, anger stirring in his chest. "Then we'll fight him," he said. Lone Hawk gave him a long look. "To fight him, you must understand him first. Men like Brig fear what they cannot control. They use fear to shape others. The real fight is not with his gun, but with his heart." The girl listened quietly, clutching her mother's shawl.
"Mama said kindness is stronger than hate," she whispered.
Lone Hawk nodded. She was right. But kindness must be guarded. It is light, and light draws shadows. Later that night, while the twins slept, Lone Hawk stayed awake, staring at the stars. He felt the pull of memory, the loss of his family, the betrayal of peace between his people and the settlers. He knew the past had not died. It lived on in the children sleeping beside him. He made a silent promise to protect them, no matter the cost. By morning, the wind had shifted again. They followed the stream until they reached a small valley where tall grass swayed in the breeze. Lone Hawk said they could rest there for a while. He showed the boy how to set traps and taught the girl to grind herbs into medicine. Slowly, they began to feel like they belonged somewhere again, even if only for a short time. But peace in the desert never lasted long. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, they heard the distant cry of a hawk. Lone Hawk stood still, listening. "That is not a wild call," he said. "It is a signal." The boy's stomach tightened. "What do we do?" The warrior's eyes narrowed. "We move." They gathered their few things quickly and began to climb toward the rocks overlooking the valley. Halfway up, the girl slipped and fell, her cry echoing across the open space. Below them, movement stirred. The glint of rifles flashed in the sunlight. Men were already there, closing in. Lone Hawk pushed the twins ahead of him, shouting for them to run. Shots rang out, kicking up dust near their feet. The boy pulled his sister behind a boulder, his heart racing. Lone Hawk fired an arrow, striking one of the riders, but there were too many. "Keep going," he shouted. The twins scrambled up the slope, their hands scraping against stone. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of the men and the crack of gunfire. Lone Hawk stood his ground, his bow moving faster than the eye could follow. He fought not for glory, but for time. When the twins finally reached the ridge, the boy turned back. He saw the warrior still standing, arrows spent, facing the men who advanced with rifles raised. The boy wanted to go back, but his sister pulled him onward. They ran until the land opened before them again, endless and wild. As darkness fell, they found shelter beneath a broken tree. The boy held the bow he still carried from before, the one that had belonged to Lone Hawk. The girl curled beside him, whispering why he'll find us. The boy wanted to believe her, but his chest ached with doubt. In the distance, the faint glow of fire lit the horizon again. The desert seemed alive with whispers, the wind, the coyotes, and something older, something that seemed to call their names. They were alone now, caught between two worlds that had both rejected them, running from men they barely understood. Yet somewhere in the darkness, perhaps unseen, perhaps waiting, the spirit of the Apache warrior still moved with the wind guarding them. The night stretched wide and uncertain, and the twins didn't know that the next dawn would bring them face to face with the truth their mother had kept hidden. The truth that could change everything. The night stretched long and heavy, and the cold seeped deep into their bones. The twins huddled beneath the broken tree, their faces pale in the silver glow of the moon. The boy kept his mother's shawl wrapped tightly around his sister, while clutching Lone Hawk's bow against his chest. He didn't know if the warrior was alive, but he kept hearing his words in his mind. To survive, you must listen to the land. The desert seemed to breathe around them, the wind whispering over the dry ground, carrying the far-off cries of coyotes. When dawn finally broke, the air was thick with silence. The boy rose first, scanning the horizon. Smoke still curled faintly from the valley behind them, but no riders were in sight. He helped his sister to her feet, her small frame trembling from cold and hunger. They had gone days without real food. The land ahead stretched wide, broken only by the faint shimmer of what looked like a riverbed in the distance. If we can reach the water, maybe we can rest, he said quietly. She nodded, too tired to speak. They walked for hours under the rising sun. The desert floor shimmered like glass, and heat waves bent the horizon into strange shapes. Every shadow made them wary. The boy thought of Lone Hawk and what he had said about listening. So he stopped often, crouching low to feel the wind and scan the ground. Once he noticed a faint mark in the dust, hoofprints, not old ones. He didn't tell his sister at first, but the dread in his chest grew heavier. Someone was still following them. By midday, they reached the riverbed. It was dry, but a few green patches told them there might be water nearby. They dug into the soft sand until a trickle appeared. The girl cupped her hands and drank greedily. The boy stayed alert, watching the hills. In the distance, he saw movement, dark figures against the light. 3 of them, maybe 4. His throat tightened. He grabbed his sister's hand. "We have to move," he said. She looked up, confused, then followed his gaze. The figures were coming closer. The boy led her down the riverbed, keeping low, using the tall grass as cover. The land twisted ahead into narrow passages where boulders formed a maze of shadow and rock. They slipped through, trying to stay quiet. But the sound of horses grew louder behind them. The boy's heart raced. He knew they couldn't outrun horses. They needed a place to hide. As they rounded a bend, he spotted a dark opening in the side of a hill, a small cave. He pushed his sister toward it. "Go inside," he whispered. She hesitated, fear in her eyes, but he urged her on. Once she was inside, he crawled in beside her, pulling the shawl across the entrance to dull the light. Outside, the riders slowed. The sound of boots striking the earth echoed through the canyon. The boy could hear them talking. "They came this way," one said. "Tracks lead straight here," another replied. "Then keep your eyes sharp. The boss wants them alive." The boy's breath caught. Alive. He didn't know why Brig wanted them alive, but the thought sent a chill down his spine. The girl pressed her face against his shoulder, and he could feel her shaking. He whispered softly, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." The riders dismounted, their spurs clicking. One of them came close. So close that the boy could see his shadow stretch across the entrance. The man paused, his hand brushing against the rock. The boy held his breath. For a moment it seemed the man might turn away, but then he bent down, pulling aside the shawl. The boy reacted without thinking. He swung Lone Hawk's bow, striking the man's arm. The man cursed and stumbled back. The boy grabbed his sister's hand and ran deeper into the cave. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack echoing through the stone walls. Sparks flew as bullets struck the rock near their heads. The tunnel twisted downward, and they kept running until the sound of gunfire faded. Darkness swallowed them. The boy's chest heaved. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The girl shook her head. They stopped, trying to catch their breath. The cave smelled of earth and stone, damp and old. The boy lit a small stick with a match from Lone Hawk's pouch. The flickering light showed walls covered with faded markings, symbols, and handprints in red clay. The girl stared in awe. "What is this place?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said, "but maybe it's where his people came." The air was still and the ground sloped downward into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily. They followed the sound until they reached an underground pool. The girl knelt and drank, her reflection rippling on the surface. For the first time since they fled, she smiled faintly. "Mama would have liked this place," she said softly. The boy nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lone Hawk had said. The truth of their blood, the promise their mother carried. Something inside him felt unfinished, as if there was more to her story than they'd ever known. He turned to the cave walls again, studying the markings. One symbol caught his eye, a hawk drawn above two smaller figures holding hands. It sent a shiver through him. "He's been here," he whispered. Before they could speak again, a noise came from behind them. The sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel. The girl gasped. The boy put out the flame and pulled her behind a rock. Shadows danced along the walls as torchlight approached. The men had followed. "Spread out," one of them said. "They're in here." The twins crouched low, hearts hammering. The boy gripped the broken bow tightly, his palms slick with sweat. The girl's small hand found his, trembling. The men's voices grew closer, their light sweeping over the cave walls. One of them stopped near the pool. "Tracks," he said. "They're close," the boy's mind raced. If they stayed, they'd be caught. He looked at the water. It was deep, dark, and cold. "Can you swim?" he whispered. The girl nodded faintly. "Then follow me." They slipped silently into the pool, the cold shocking their skin. They swam beneath the surface, holding their breath as the men's voices echoed above. The boy's lungs burned, but he pushed forward until the tunnel narrowed and opened into another chamber. When they surfaced, gasping, the sound of the men was distant again. The chamber was lit faintly by cracks in the rock above where sunlight filtered through. Strange carvings covered the walls here too. Faces, animals, stars. In the center stood a small stone altar. Resting upon it was a bundle wrapped in animal hide. The boy stepped closer, curiosity and fear twisting inside him. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a carved necklace made of bone and turquoise. The pendant was shaped like a hawk's wing. The girl whispered, "It's his." The boy held it in his hands. It felt warm, almost alive. He didn't understand how, but he knew Lone Hawk had left it for them, or maybe their mother had. Either way, it was a sign. He slipped it around his neck just as a rumble shook the cave. Dust rained from the ceiling. The sound of voices returned, louder this time. "They went through here," one of the men shouted. The twins turned toward a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber. The boy took his sister's hand and they ran again, stumbling through the darkness. Behind them came the echo of boots and angry shouts. The tunnel climbed upward until they burst out into daylight. They found themselves high above the desert, standing on a rocky ridge that overlooked miles of wild land. The sun burned bright and the wind whipped their hair. The boy looked back. The men were still climbing after them. Down below, the desert stretched toward the far mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the place Lone Hawk had spoken of, a hidden valley where his people sometimes gathered. If they could reach it, maybe they'd find help. But it was far, and the riders would soon have horses again. The boy scanned the ridge for another path. The only way down was a narrow trail hugging the cliffs. "We have to move," he said. The girl looked at the drop below, fear in her eyes. "I'm scared." "I am too," he said quietly. "But we have to keep going. For Mama. For him." They started down the trail, rocks crumbling beneath their feet. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the shouts of the men above. One bullet struck the stone beside them, sending sparks flying. The girl screamed, slipping on the loose gravel. The boy caught her arm just in time, pulling her close. They kept moving, every step a struggle. Behind them, the riders closed in, their rifles glinting in the sun. The boy's mind raced. There had to be a way to lose them. At the base of the ridge, a dry river split in two directions. He pointed to the narrower one lined with thick brush. "That way," he said. They plunged into the overgrowth, the branches scratching their skin. The sound of hooves thundered behind them. The girl stumbled, exhausted, and the boy lifted her up, refusing to stop. He could see the shimmer of heat rising from the open desert ahead. Somewhere in that shimmering distance, he swore he saw movement. A lone figure on horseback, dark against the sun. Hope flickered for the first time. He wasn't sure if it was real, but it was enough to make him run harder. The men shouted behind them, closing in fast. The boy reached the edge of the canyon and turned back, his heart pounding as the figure on the horizon began to move toward them. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint cry of a hawk. The boy gripped the pendant at his chest, the world around him trembling with tension. The riders were seconds away, the canyon narrow and unforgiving. The girl clung to him, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" The boy looked at the oncoming men, then at the figure racing toward them from the other side. The sun flared behind the dust, and the sound of hooves grew louder, echoing like thunder across the plains. Everything seemed to stop. The breath of the wind, the beat of their hearts, the turning of time itself. As the storm of fate came rushing toward them, the sound of hooves grew louder, filling the canyon like a storm breaking loose. The boy shielded his sister as dust swirled around them, stinging their eyes. The riders were almost upon them when the lone figure on horseback burst through the haze. It was Lone Hawk. His bow was drawn, his eyes sharp as the wind tore at his hair. He rode straight toward the men without hesitation, loosing an arrow that struck the lead rider's rifle clean from his hands. The echo of the shot rolled across the desert like thunder. The men shouted, scattering in confusion. Lone Hawk's horse slid to a halt beside the twins. He dismounted swiftly and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You listened," he said, his voice low but strong. The boy could only nod, still breathless from fear and relief. The girl clung to Lone Hawk's leg, trembling. He looked down at her and smiled faintly. "You did well, little one. The land has watched over you both." The riders regrouped in the distance, their leader raising his rifle. Lone Hawk motioned for the twins to stay low as he nocked another arrow. But before he could shoot, the sound of hooves came again, this time from behind the ridge. Another group of riders appeared, dressed not like the first but in the simple gear of settlers. At their head rode Mr. Carter, the rancher who had once helped Lone Hawk hide the children's mother. He and his men had followed the trail after hearing of the attack on the valley. Caught between two sides, the outlaws faltered. Lone Hawk raised his hand, signaling the settlers to hold fire. For a moment, the desert went still. Then one of the outlaws, their leader, Brig, shouted across the distance, "You can't hide them forever, Hawk." "That woman's gone, and her blood's cursed." Lone Hawk's expression darkened. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind. "Her blood gave life to these children. You cannot curse what was born from truth." Briggs spat in the sand, fired a single reckless shot, and turned to flee. The settlers returned fire, and within moments the outlaws were retreating toward the valley, disappearing into the rising dust. Silence fell once more. Lone Hawk turned to the children, his face calm but heavy with thought. "The land tests those it wishes to keep," he said quietly. "You've both walked its hardest path and still stand." Mr. Carter dismounted, looking at the twins with a mixture of sorrow and awe. "So it's true," he murmured. "They're hers," Lone Hawk nodded. "They are all that remains of her promise." The settlers helped them back to camp where a small fire was burning. The girl sat beside Lone Hawk, her head resting on his arm while the boy warmed his hands near the flames. Carter handed them water and food, watching them eat in silence. "You'll need a safe place," he said after a while. "The world won't understand who they are or what they carry." Lone Hawk looked into the flames. "They will not hide forever. One day they will need to stand in both worlds." The boy looked up, confusion clouding his eyes. "What does that mean?" Lone Hawk smiled faintly. "Your mother's heart belonged to two worlds. So does yours. The time will come when you'll have to decide what kind of people you want to be." That night, under the starlit sky, Lone Hawk told them everything. He spoke of their mother, the woman who had once come to the desert seeking peace but found something deeper. How she had met him while helping his people during a harsh winter. How she refused to leave when soldiers came, choosing love over safety, and how she'd hidden the children when danger returned. The girl listened with tears in her eyes. Did she know she wouldn't come back? She asked. Lone Hawk looked away, the firelight flickering across his face. "She knew the cost of love," he said softly. "But she also knew love never dies. It changes form, but it stays." The boy reached for the pendant around his neck, the hawk's wing carved from bone and turquoise. "She left this for us, didn't she?" Lone Hawk nodded. "It carries her spirit, and now it carries yours." As dawn approached, they broke camp. Carter offered to take the twins to his ranch until it was safe. Lone Hawk agreed but promised to return for them soon. The boy didn't want to leave his side. "What if something happens to you?" he asked. Lone Hawk placed a hand on his shoulder. "The land knows my path. If you ever lose your way, listen to the wind. It will carry my voice." They rode through the soft morning light, the air filled with the scent of sage and dust. When they reached the ranch, Carter's wife took the children in, giving them warm food and clean clothes. For the first time in weeks, they slept without fear. Lone Hawk stayed one night before departing again into the desert. The girl cried quietly as he rode away, but the boy watched with quiet determination. He understood something his sister didn't yet, that their lives were part of something larger than either of them could see. Months passed. The twins learned to live at the ranch, helping Carter with the horses and learning to read from his wife. The girl began to smile again. The boy, though, spent his evenings on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. He often thought he saw a hawk flying there, circling high above the land. One evening, Carter joined him. "You still thinking about him?" he asked. The boy nodded. "I want to find him someday." Carter smiled. "You will. But until then, remember what he taught you. The world needs people who listen more than they speak." The boy looked out at the open land and said, "He said we have to stand in both worlds. Maybe that's what Mama wanted too." Carter nodded slowly. "Maybe she just wanted you to be good people no matter which world you stand in." Seasons changed. The land bloomed after a rare rain, and wildflowers painted the desert floor. The twins grew stronger, their fear replaced by quiet strength. The girl helped nurse wounded animals back to health, while the boy learned to track and ride like the people Lone Hawk came from. The pendant stayed around his neck, glowing softly in the sunlight. One day, while riding beyond the ranch fence, the boy found a feather, dark brown with streaks of white, caught in the wind. He held it up, feeling a strange calm settle over him. The sound of the wind through the grass carried something faint and familiar, like a voice whispering his name. He smiled and tucked the feather into his pocket. Years later, when they were older, the twins finally returned to the desert valley where it had all begun. The ruins of their mother's cabin still stood, covered in dust and vines. The boy, now nearly grown, led his sister to the old cave. The markings were still there, faded but strong. He placed the pendant on the stone altar, just as he had found it years before. "She's home," he said quietly. The girl stood beside him, her eyes glistening. "Do you think he's still out there?" she asked. The boy smiled faintly. "I think he never left." The wind rose again, carrying the cry of a hawk across the sky. They both looked up, watching it circle above them before vanishing into the bright light. As they turned to leave, the land seemed different, alive, watching. The boy felt peace for the first time. He understood now that their journey had never been just about survival. It was about finding belonging, about the bond between people and the earth that held them. He took his sister's hand, and together they walked back toward the valley's edge. The sun was setting, spilling gold across the horizon. Behind them, the shadow of the hawk stretched long over the sand, a reminder of everything they had lost and everything they had found. Their mother's legacy lived in them, and the spirit of the land would always guide them forward. When they reached the ridge, the boy looked back one last time. The wind brushed against his face, gentle and warm. "Thank you," he whispered to the desert. Then he turned toward the open plains where the stars were beginning to rise, leading them home. And though their journey had been born from sorrow, it ended in peace, a quiet understanding that even in a world divided by fear and memory, love endures. The land remembers. The wind carries the truth. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the hawk still flies, watching over the hearts it once saved. Top of form, bottom of form.